So, good to see you guys. Good morning. Let's jump into things. John chapter 8, verse 34. Jesus replied, "Very truly I tell you, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Now, a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son belongs to it forever. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed." One of the central themes of Jesus' ministry, and you read through the Gospels and then you see carried on throughout the first century Christians, is his returning to this image of family and his description of himself as the Son of God, the heir of the household of Jehovah, the Messiah, who would this would actually become one of the main accusations against him that would be levied against him in favor of his murder. His audacity to call himself part of God's family, his household, and then to claim to have the ability to give that inheritance to all. A new family, which is what we're going to talk about today. The earliest Christians referred to themselves most often through the letters and then through their own correspondences, most often as brothers and sisters. The family of believers. You've heard this before, yes? In August of this year, I was swimming with my kids in the Atlantic off the coast of southern Florida. We were on a 2-day layover preparing to go to Lima, Peru. And I was getting way more sunburned than I realized at the time. All of us were. But we're there and we're swimming and we're kind of having this great moment, and we're about to travel for the first time internationally as a family. Rachel and I have obviously traveled a lot internationally, but this is the first time the kids are going all together with us, right? And we're going to Lima, where it's going to be, it's a costly trip and it's going to be some travel, and you know how it is to travel with kids and then think about that internationally into a third world country, and it's a lot. So, and we know that we've already accepted the position here, and so we're coming back from that trip, and we've got about 3 weeks to pack up the house and get going. Wow. And in between that, I've got to travel to Nashville for about 6 days. So it's going to be a bit of a harrowing situation. And I'm having this moment, I'm floating in this clear, beautiful salt water with my boys, and I kind of gather them closely to me, and I go, hey, so why are we traveling across the globe to go see your great-grandmother, who's going to be 98 this year, wow, and your uncle and your other family members there in Peru? And why are we packing up our home and our house and traveling across the country a few weeks later to go be in Massachusetts near the rest of our family? Why are we doing that? And they're kind of giving me some answers. And then I land on this. I say, because family shows up. And then I make them repeat that to me. Why are we doing it? Because family shows up. Family shows up. Sociologists explained 2 dominant cultures of family outcomes that have kind of taken shape in the world today. And the first is actually historically kind of a new posture. I've mentioned it before. It's this idea of individualist or an individualism. Another way of saying that in your posture relationally is that you are oriented primarily towards your rights and your preferences above the rights and the preferences of the group that you belong to. Does that make sense? So whether that's a country or a company or a church or a family, an individualist starts with me and what I want first. And there are lots of ways that we've kind of come to this point of view. But one of them is essentially from the belief that we're all just here by some cosmic accident, right? You and I are just simply biological lottery winners who happen to be in the right place at the right time, 3.8 billion years ago, when the right compounds just happen to mix together. And now we're just simply, the fast forward of that, we're really still running on some prehistoric, instincts of sex and eating fats and sugars and being afraid of rustling leaves or whatever, because might be a tiger in there, right? So we're kind of still in this. This is how this is the story of humanity we can tell ourselves. And ethics based on this view would hold very little reasoning why the modern individual should be anything other than that, an individual who thinks about themselves first. Why? Because there's no longer any need for a tribe to care for your basic survival. And that archaic patriarchy of our old history, we don't even need that anymore because your father doesn't need to tell you what to do for a job or who to marry. You can just go figure that out now on your own. Are you with me right there? There's no moral law against you autonomously living for your pleasure and your interests first. In fact, it's actually a sin if you don't live for yourself. You owe it to yourself as a person to put yourself first, to think about what will make you happy in your pursuits in life. And the power of preference can be triumphed by none. It drives our economy forward. Now, obviously, we're not entirely an individualist culture, right? This is a bit of a gross over-exaggeration, but because there's still moments. There still have moments in our history, in our story, major events, wars, where we collectively come together and we take care of each other. We get out there and we plow snow for each other when it hits, right? We do what has to happen for our community. But by and large, if you think about it, we still have been very much spiritually shaped to think this way. Again, a bit of a gross over-exaggeration, but the U.S. has everything it needs to end homelessness, to end any hunger in the U.S. We have everything we need to house each and every child in the foster care system. Collectively, we have everything we need, all the resources we need to house our elderly in the later years of their life, rather than sending them to a dorm room with strangers, right? I learned this new phrase called elder orphans. And it's actually the increasing population of the U.S. today that is spending the last 10 to 15 years of their lives alone because they don't have family. It's the outcome of an individualized culture. And so in place of actual family taking care of each other, we create industry on it, about it, or over it, through it. We ask the government to take care of those things for us. We continue to write our individual stories. And this isn't a critique as much as it's a bit of an observation for us. It's what we built. And you know what? By and large, it works. It works. Like, you are not really that bothered by people outside of your family in your day in, day in functioning of life, right? Day in, day out function of life. You're not. Your tax dollars go to help support some of those things, and maybe you have some strong feelings about that, but you're not really bothered. We've shaped this. What does all this on our own way of living produce? Well, quite honestly, it produces wealth, and a lot of it. Pew Research Center did a study on the correlation of the GDP of a country and the amount of people who live alone in that country. Guess what? The high correlation, right? So the countries with the highest GDP synonymously have the highest individual households. Why is that? Because you got to pursue it at all costs. Your career, your bottom line, your retirement, are you with me right there? And what has all this pursuing of our story done? It's left us lonely. We're the most anxious, insecure, self-consumed, depressed, medicated culture on the planet in all of human history. How do we intentionally move away from this kind of spiritual formation in our lives? Enter King Jesus. Amen? Take a look at Mark chapter 3 with me here. Verse 31 says, "Then Jesus' mother and brothers arrived, standing outside. They sent someone in to call him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they told him, 'Your mother and your brothers are outside looking for you.' 'Who are my mother and my brothers?' he asked. Then he looked at those seated in the circle around him and said, 'Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother.'" Jesus is teaching in this crowded house, right? You can kind of imagine the scene, small homes in those days, right? It's crowded one-room house, and his family, his mother and his brothers, they come to take charge of him, it says in another passage, and they think he's lost his mind, essentially, right? And so they're there to bring him home, and they knock on, can you go in and tell Jesus that we're here to see him? And somebody goes in, and they call, Jesus, your mom's here. She says you got to go home. You know, like there's kind of this moment, right? Like, and then you hear his response. Imagine if you're Mary and you hear your firstborn son's response in this way. Oh, who's your mother? As you're taking off your sandal, huh? Right to go. Like who's the one that carried you for 9 months? Is that you forgot, huh, Jesus? You can imagine the response, right? Why? Because Jesus lived in a very strong, patriarchal, collectivist society. So we talked about individualist, right? Collectivist is the other side of that story. It's actually the way that most of humanity has lived as long as we've lived. Collectivist is a relational orientation towards the rights and the interests of the group you belong to above your personal rights and interests. You see the difference there? One in which bloodline and the future of the family, it was all dependent upon the family not looking out for themselves individually, but looking out for each other collectively. Everything, who you were in your entire story was not determined by you, but by your family. I want to explain a slide here. This is kind of how it looked. This actually reshaped your alignments, your allegiances. So if a father had a daughter and a son, and then that son and daughter were married, the allegiance, the primary allegiance for that daughter was not to her husband first, but to her brother. This is first century Palestine family. This is the imagination that they have about family. Are you with me right there? Same way for a son who had married a wife, his primary allegiance in a time of need was not to his wife, his spouse, but to his sister first, his siblings, and they to their father. Joseph Hellerman is professor of New Testament literature at Biola. He wrote this book called When the Church Was a Family. It's a fantastic book. But this is what he has to say. The blood bonds between siblings, not between husband and wife, is the most intimate, nurturing, and ultimately satisfying relationship for the persons in collectivist cultures. The closest family bond was not the bond of marriage, it was the bond of siblings. Correspondingly, the most treacherous act of human disloyalty in ancient family was not disloyalty to one's spouse. It was the betrayal of one's brother. This is the understanding of all those listening as Jesus now defines the church as a family. One of siblings that are connected and in bond of allegiance to one another. His audience, they knew the implications of what he was saying. In a strong collectivist culture, this was suddenly more than just a teacher or a rabbi with some good insights to listen to on the weekend, something to tickle your brain if you're bored or whatever, right? This was more than just a salvation memory or salvation message for the individual. This was now a new community that would be identified as a family and would belong to each other. They had differences. Politically, religiously, racially, economically, generationally, there were differences. And Jesus says they're now family because of their connection to the Father. And they're to see one another as siblings. And so Jesus doesn't come to define the church as a club or a school or a military or a government or any other number of ways that we might organize people, right? He chooses to call it instead a family. And in that room and for all time, he realigns the loyalties of his bonds beyond the scope of physical lineage and opening up a way to connect with anyone. Anyone who would choose the invitation to do the Father's will. They were forging family together. I want you to imagine you're the lonely tax collector If you've seen the Chosen series, you kind of put a mental image in your mind, right? Imagine you're the lonely tax collector or you're the prostitute, and imagine the thoughts and the emotions as you look across the table and Jesus looks you in the eyes and says, we're family now. You and I, we're family. You belong to me. I'm going to be your brother. Imagine what you're feeling as he communicates, you belong here. I love you like a mother or a brother or a sister. You sit at my table. You're part of my household. Now, imagine you're not on the outside of society. You're not an outcast, right? You don't live on the fringes or the margins. You're a pretty normal person, right? Like you're middle of the road. Imagine what you're thinking as Jesus looks at the prostitutes and the tax collectors and says, these are now your family. You might be feeling some things, right? That's a little too much, Jesus. Like I'm good with, somebody who's just, in society, they're a little above me in my class, right? Like I'll be family with those people. Yeah, open up the doors, let me in, right? But when you start talking about the people on the margins, is that who am I going to see them as brothers and sisters now? Is that what you're saying, Jesus? That I'm to treat them as I would my brother or my sister? I mean, gosh, Jesus, I like the church, I like the worship, it's really nice, and the messages are good, and the lighting's nice, the building is good, but this is a little too close to home, Jesus. To treat these people as my brother or sister? The other? What do we think when we tend to think of family? Well, in our kind of day and age, we tend to think particularly of the nuclear family, right? The mom and the dad and the 2.5 kids. I don't know what the 0.5 is exactly. She's pregnant or it's a dog or something. I don't know what it is, but 2.5, right? Those are the people that we tend to think of as our family. Those are who I'm responsible for, right? And you ask me, that's kind of how I initially think of my family. I think of my kids and my wife, and then beyond that, it kind of goes out in layers, right? So when we say to one another in the church, I want the church to be more like a family, how are we measuring that? How do we measure what we want the church to look like exactly? Is it based on what we define as family? Is it based on how we imagine family being? David Brooks wrote an article in The Atlantic. He points this out in a really beautiful way about the nuclear family as really it was a 15-year experiment in the U.S. history, right? From about 1950 to 1965, when people began to move away from their farms and their families and the cousins and the uncles and everybody who lived together, and they began to kind of set out on their own and try to establish their own families. It was a 15-year experiment, and it failed. It didn't exist before that, and afterwards, it led to the most individualist culture and actually the most single head of household demographic in our history. Meaning, more single parents came up after the nuclear family experiment, where people moved away from the network that they were embedded in. Am I making sense? Where they grew up with the uncle who lived right next door, and grandma lived with you, and you know what I'm talking about? Like just it changed everything. It changed our whole society. And he says this, our culture is oddly stuck. We want stability and rootedness, but also mobility and dynamic capitalism and the liberty to adopt the lifestyle we choose. We want close families, but not the legal, cultural, and sociological constraints that made them possible. So we want the utility of feeling connected, basically. Right? We want to feel connected. This is why we call our companies and the places we work for family. Right? That gives you a 15-minute break so you can be more productive. That's your family. We want to call these places family. Why? Because we long to feel that connection, but we don't want the social constraints that come with it. We don't want the belonging to others that come with it. We want to still live our story and be who we want to be and do what we want to do. And don't bother me too much, right? I've punched out. This is why we call our hobbies communities now, right? The CrossFit community or whatever it is, right? And I work for the Starbucks family, and I go to my CrossFit community throughout the week, right? We've warped these ideas because now they're just about utility for me and my story. Because in this individualist culture, family and community they end up being defined by those that agree with me and the things that I'm into and are supporting me as a productive individual. This is why people in the church world, we say things like, I just moved on because I just felt like I wasn't getting fed. Or, it just wasn't meeting my needs. Or I just outgrew the church. Have you ever heard those things before? Have you ever felt those things before? Where does that come from? Jesus defines the church community as a family, not because they agreed about everything. Some of them were carrying weapons on themselves, thinking about killing the other people in the room. It wasn't like they were just all kumbaya, my Lord, around the table all of a sudden, but he was redefining for them how their relationships were going to look and what they were going to expect of each other outside of their family. They were going to now call each other family, because they were deeply committed to the Father's will in their lives. And that included loving people who were their enemies, as though they were their brothers, as though they were their sisters. The way of Jesus for me, it has been really counterintuitive in my own just journey. Right? I grew up with kind of nuclear family idea, and we had family around us, and we would see them for holidays, and there were certain members that would come every now and then. And then we had, other members that were close. My grandmother was very close. She lived here in Holyoke for a long time, off High Street there. So there were family that was close and not close, but I didn't have, at least in my imagination, I didn't have this sense of like, I belong to all these people and they need to give me my identity and tell me what to do with my life. So at 19, when I thought about what am I going to do with my life, I said, well, I'm going to start driving west. And I packed up a car, and when I packed up my buddy's car, I had a backpack, a guitar, and a sleeping bag, and less than $200. I had less than $20 when I got out there. And we moved west, right? And I didn't come back for 20 years. I just got back, right? Because in my mind, I had to actually, the last 20 years, God has been reshaping me to revalue what family means. And then I started having my own kids. And then you start thinking, man, how do I want them to grow up and treat me? Where are they going to see that modeled? How do I want them to treat each other? Where are they going to see that modeled? Okay, so maybe I need to reconsider how I'm thinking about family here, right? And so then you start, are you with me? And God's been shaping me and changing, but that reshaping has come through the church family, believe it or not. Not because I just started reading David Brooks and going, man, I need to change my path here. No, it came through the church community and me allowing the church community to be a family in my life, helping me overcome addiction, the church family. Helping me go back to school and then help me get through school, the church family, right? Help me find my wife, the church family. Help me keep my wife because of my own problems, the church family, right? Helping me with my parenting, the church family, jobs that I've gotten, helping me with all the things of my life, the church family. Not the church institutionally, not the church as an acronym, but the church family in relationships. People who are willing to take me in as their own and treat me that way. Family is tough. It's hard. And we all, with the holidays coming up, right, we've all got that one family member that we're like, if they caught, cold this year, it wouldn't be the worst thing, right? If they couldn't make it to Thanksgiving. We've got that family member that you're like, gosh, I really hope they don't bring up this thing at dinner. Please, not this year, And if you don't have that family member, guess what, right? Like, you are that family member. They just haven't told you yet. But family's tough. But there is no option if we're actually seeking the kingdom of heaven on earth. There's no other option than to treat the church as a family. And it doesn't just happen. And you've already been spiritually shaped against it. And I'm not saying we're going to get back to first century Palestine. We're not. And I don't think we have to. I don't think that's what Jesus is calling us to. But I do think he's calling us to a radical reevaluation of what we would consider family and who we would consider family, and to broaden our scope of that group of people well beyond those that share our last name and into the group of people that we see here in this room. If we're really going to seek the kingdom of heaven come to earth, it's going to require that we rise above partisanship. And that we can be family with those who sit on the other side of the aisle, or vote differently, or feel very strongly about social issues that are different than ours. That we can love them and sit at the table together with them and pass communion together. We have to rise above racial divides. We have to rise above our rights and our preferences, especially when we're offended and we feel like they haven't been, they've been transgressed. My rights have been transgressed. My preferences have not been met. And now I'm required to forgive people. Well, that's really hard. They should have just done what I liked. Made it easy for me to be here. Don't you know how hard it is to be a Christian already? Why do I have to work through forgiveness issues now, right? Are you with me? We've got to be able to go beyond a preference, go beyond the individualist shaping of who we've become to become family. How do we do this? Well, John says you can't say you love God and not love those who are your brothers and sisters. You can't say you love God who you don't see and not love the people that you do see. So there's some sort of action that must be taken there, right? Jesus comes and offers us something stronger than the world around us, if we'll let it reshape us, if we'll let it work against the shaping of the world. I can tell you what is on tap for us, and I think many of us have taken hold of it, and I'll share a little bit about that in a second, but what's on tap for us here is it's an inclusive exclusivity. Meaning, the invitation is open to everyone to be a part of this new family. Everyone. Anyone. And let me just say, if you're visiting with us, if you're still kind of figuring out if you want to hang out a little bit longer with us, right? I just want you to know you are welcome at the dinner table. We do things like we take communion together. You are welcome to take communion with us, wherever you are in your journey. You are welcome to worship with us, to fellowship with us, because we're trying to be family. But we've got to learn to extend this beyond ourselves, and so it's very inclusive, and yet Jesus makes it very exclusive. How does he do that? He says it's anyone who would do the will of God. So it's inclusive, it's open to everybody, and yet it's exclusive to those who would do the will of God. And we've got to be able to figure that out and hold those tensions. The church, as Jesus defines it, is meant to stand in the gap for the broken, the discouraged, the anxious, the depressed, the displaced, the lonely world, and offer them family. And legislation hasn't accomplished that. Technology has not accomplished that. Academia has not accomplished that. Progressive ideology and conservative ideology have not accomplished that. Only the church can. Can we stand as a signpost, as a community, serving as a signpost to the rest of the world that, hey, there is something really good here. The kingdom has come. This thing that Jesus invited us to is so much more than just showing up to a nice church on Sunday. It is a relational bond that will carry you through this life. It's a family. And you know what? The best is yet to come. Amen. That's what the church is meant to stand as just this light that says, man, look how good this is, and the best is yet to come. That doesn't happen through how eloquently we speak. It happens through relationships. It doesn't happen through how good we can argue scriptures. You know what? Most people in the world don't care about your scriptures. Or they have some pretty strong feelings about your scriptures that are not the ones you share. They don't care how much you know or you can argue with them to win them over rationally with your theology. They really just don't care. But if you can invite them into your home, if you can love them as a brother or sister, if you can invite them in to a family that you're already a part of, man, that begins to now stand out because that's something that they haven't figured out. Are you with me? God didn't come as a politician or a philosopher or a superior deity on a throne. He did not come as a businessman or a professor or a doctor or a social justice warrior. He didn't come in the form of personal enlightenment or unique interpretation. He came as a baby born in a family, dependent on a family. And he lived in obscurity for 30 years in a collectivist identity. And then he comes out of that teaching and preaching a way of the kingdom and inviting people into that new family. Romans chapter 8, as we close out here. Paul says, for those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, to be reshaped, to undergo a spiritual formation that shapes them to become more like Jesus, so that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. A family. A family. I got to say, I'm really inspired by how the Pioneer Valley Church does family. I had about 6 meetings this week with people where I asked them some questions about what does the good news mean? And then how have you seen the good news displayed in the church community? And it was interesting because the good news started very cognitively. Like the good news is that Jesus died for your sins and he resurrected from the dead and you can now be a part of the kingdom. It started very cognitively. But when I asked, well, how have you seen the good news displayed in your church family? Do you know what came out? When the building or the home burned down across the street. And the church gathered together and took people in and became a resource center. When Connor has his accident, people shared about this. When people's family members had died and they rallied around. When the church went through some leadership shakeup and they didn't have anybody and people came together and figured it out together and went and found somebody together. So suddenly the gospel went from this cognitive thing to a relational thing. Are you with me? That's the story we're telling. And if we can move our own kind of mind's eye, how we understand things, our own imagination, away a little bit more from the rational, let's argue with people about the way of Jesus kind of a thing, to a little bit more of the social, hey, this is actually how the gospel gets displayed, then maybe we'll start paying attention to other things. Then rather, is this person going to be open to the ideology I'm going to try to convince them of? And as we reach out to people. Am I making sense? We can kind of start to go, that person, they're going to be really hard to get through logically, so I'm not going to even try. What if instead we displayed the gospel relationally by loving people as a community? And we're already doing that. I'm just trying to help you reimagine that that's what it is. And then with this, what do we start to look for? We start to look for opportunities to do that. Handing out an invitation to church is fantastic. A lot of us have come to church for that, right? How many of you were just met by somebody who invited you to church and you started coming? A lot of us, right? Sitting down with somebody and talking to them about the scriptures, it's good, it's right, we're going to do that. But is that how we display the gospel? I can tell you, you already don't think of it that way. You already think of it as loving people like family. Man, now we can look for those opportunities to do that more. I hope I'm making sense. If you're considering yourself part of this church and you're you're considering yourself part of this family, but you don't show up or you don't contribute, I think you have to really wrestle with that. And that's not please don't hear that in any way threatening at all. I'm actually saying that because I want you to wrestle with that. I want you to wrestle with, am I getting the most out of what Jesus is really offering me here? By just kind of taking it or leaving it or using it at my convenience, and when it doesn't really just don't show up. Or are you with me? Yeah. So I want to win you over. There's so much more. I mean, Rachel and I have just been amazed by how much love there is in this community. We feel really humbled and a little embarrassed by it. I feel embarrassed by it at least sometimes. I'm like, gosh, I have just got to become way more loving. Like, I'm just not there, right? But you guys are there. So many of you there. But I know that there are some on the fringes still, because they're in every church community. Let me appeal to you. There's so much more available if you will open yourself up relationally, if you will invest relationally, if you will make time relationally, if you will begin to contribute relationally. And the people who go, oh, the church used to be a family. I go, maybe you used to act a little bit more like family. And that's why you had a reciprocal relationship with people in your life that felt like family. But as your life got busier, as your life got more complicated, as you became a little bit more reshaped as an individualist over the last 30 years, because that's the culture you live in, maybe you're acting a little less like family and a little bit more like a consumer today. But let me win you over. The family, the inclusive, exclusive invitation is still there to experience family. And I hope you do. I really hope you do. I hope to grow in this. We have a beautiful family here in the Pioneer Valley Church, and there's more to discover, obviously. But I think one of the ways that we can begin to lean into this a little bit more, you've had this theme of hospitality, right? We've been talking about that in different ways throughout the year. Are you actually hosting people, though? Like, it's nice, again, we can kind of go, oh, well, I love the idea of hospitality. Totally agree with that. Are you hosting people in your home? Will you have somebody over and host them for a meal? Will you bring people in? Will you gather them around the table, knowing that they think very differently than what you think, or even of each other? You gather them around the table and you break bread together and you display the gospel to one another. Are you doing that? Are you practicing that? Why? Because family shows up. Family shows up. And we are called to be the new family by a Son who has set us free, indeed, to be that family. God bless you.